I want to share with you some thoughts on the beginning of the Gospel of Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. And this little intro really is just so that you can see me and so I can say hello before we properly start looking at this passage. So let's begin. Have you ever noticed the titles of the four Gospels in our Bibles? We're used to thinking that there are four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But there aren't. There's only one Gospel, the Gospel of Jesus Christ. The first four books of the New Testament are the Gospels according to Matthew, according to Mark, and so on. So let's see how Mark understands that this one Gospel starts. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Mark is doing three things in writing his gospel. I'm sure he's doing a lot more, but there's three things that I've noticed and three things I want to share with you. The first is that he is putting down on paper the basic message of the church, the church's preaching that up to that point had been passed from mouth to mouth. At the same time, he's taking the opportunity to record some of the memories of the Apostle Peter. And perhaps less obviously, he's placing the message of Jesus in the context of the wider history of God's work in the world. And it's this third aspect that I really want to spend some time on. But perhaps I need to say just a word or two about the other two elements of Mark's Gospel. We don't really know exactly when Mark wrote his Gospel. Many scholars today reckon that he wrote it somewhere between 65 and 75 AD, although others believe it was a bit earlier and perhaps in the mid-50s. So even at the earliest, it was pretty much 20 years after Jesus' death, and according to the others, could have been almost 50. So that raises an obvious question. Why wasn't it written earlier? Well, remember that the spread of the Christian message was by and large amongst ordinary people. Many of them weren't even literate, but even some of the leaders of the church weren't scholars. They didn't have trained pastors or Bible colleges or anything like that, no full-time workers, or not many. But many of them would have learnt the message by heart, learnt it from others and passed it on by word of mouth. And since they believed that Jesus would return soon anyway and bring the world to an end, there was no reason why they should go to the effort of writing things down. And for those who mattered, for those who would be doing the formal preaching, the story was well known anyway, wasn't it? So okay, it's understandable that it wasn't written down. So a second question then is, so what was different? Why now? Why did Mark write his gospel? Well, the older generation, the original generation, were getting older. Some had even died. And perhaps the idea was beginning to dawn that Jesus might be taking a little longer to return than expected. And so for the first time, Christians needed to make sure that the message was preserved for the next generation. In addition to that, Jesus' prediction had come true that the gospel would be preached across the world. And it extended now already across the whole known world. So again, maybe the time had come to make sure that people knew the truth. People in far-flung Spain, China, wherever, knew the facts. So Mark wrote his gospel. As an incidental benefit, Mark was able to preserve Peter's recollections. Although Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, you find lots of vivid descriptions and personal insights, little extras that are missing in the others. It seems clear that Mark went to Peter to get a clearer picture of the events about which he was writing. So that brings us to the main point of this very beginning in Mark's Gospel, the wider context of God's work in the world and the Gospel, how the Gospel fits into that. Why do I say that Mark addresses this in particular? Well, because of the way he starts the Gospel. The very first word he says is acher. It tells us everything about what he's thinking. Acher, beginning. Not even the beginning or in the beginning, but simply, absolutely abruptly, basically, beginning. And in doing this, he introduces us very abruptly to this message that he's concerned about, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And he builds a link in doing this with the story of creation, because Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 begins in much the same way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And anyone reading the way Mark has begun would think almost automatically of Genesis chapter 1. And so the Old Testament recorded the beginning of God's creation and his work of redemption in the world, which he worked through the nation of Israel. Now Mark is telling us that he's making a new beginning, and this time not by means of the law, but the gospel. But he does more than that. He pins down his claim by a prophecy that clearly relates to the work of John the Baptist and how he was a messenger pointing us to Jesus. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Now, it's not entirely obvious that this quotation of Mark's has strong links with a passage in Exodus. It's not a passage that's terribly well known, but it does. Exodus chapter 23:20. See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. This was a promise to Moses at the very time when the law was given. In Exodus, God is really talking about the angel that literally went before them and brought them to the promised land. It was very visible and it was an immediate experience. It manifested itself in a cloudy pillar by day and a fiery pillar by night. And it remained over the Ark of the Covenant while they rested during the night. But even though we know that it was fulfilled pretty immediately, you can see the link of thought, link of ideas between Mark and the prophecy in Exodus. There's a messenger. Okay, he's an angel in Exodus, but angel is just another translation of the word messenger. He was a messenger. And God sent the messenger. And his purpose was to prepare a place, a way, a route. But Mark's quotation was a little more complex than that. And since he tells us that prophecy is from Isaiah, I suppose it's only right that we look in Isaiah to see what Isaiah has to say. And so we find in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3 something that fits remarkably well. A voice of one calling, "In the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Primarily the second half of Mark's quotation is there, but once again we get the same elements. There is a messenger. This time he's not described, we don't know anything about him. It's a voice calling, but it's a messenger. And again it's about preparing the way for the Lord. And then in this amazing quotation of Mark's that's a lot more complex than it looks, there is a core message that many would recognise coming from Malachi. "I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me." And there it is again, the messenger who is sent and prepares a way. All the same ingredients. So here you have rather a surprising situation where this single simple quotation links Moses and Isaiah and Malachi. So having begun with creation, having pointed us to creation, Mark kind of steps us through the actions and activities of God, the work of redemption, and the promises, the new beginnings that are outlined in some of these activities. So with Moses in the Exodus, this was a new beginning, the beginning of a nation. And not just any nation, but the nation through which God would work his work of redemption. And then Isaiah spoke at a time when the people were in exile, but calling them back. They had failed. They had disobeyed God and they had been punished, and the nation had been destroyed effectively. Indeed, Isaiah calls them back and says, "Look, begin again with a new beginning, a second opportunity." And then Malachi lived at the very end of the Old Testament, which is significant in itself. Calling to what has to happen beyond. And he lives in the time of Reconstruction, already well advanced. And yet, even in his time, there is a gap between the hoped for spiritual renaissance and the reality of life. So that the prophet tells us that God would send a messenger to lead the nation to the time when God would dwell fully once more amongst his people. So you see this progress and this constant work of God giving us a new chance to begin. And then we find Mark telling us that John the Baptist was just that messenger, and that he was pointing to Jesus, the fulfillment of that promise and a new beginning. The whole history of God's preparation of salvation has led us to this point and this gospel. But it goes further. Amazingly, even that's not enough, because we find in John there's some parallels with Mark. John also begins with Acher, the beginning, pointing us back again to creation. And just as in creation the commands day by day were spoken and it was so, John emphasizes the word in that act of creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And in fact, he then goes on to point out that John the Baptist, which is the John he refers to here, that John the Baptist was God's messenger. John testified concerning him He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." But all this progress, these new beginnings that God constantly offers to his people, and the beginning that has been presented to us, is merely the beginning. Both Mark and John are at pains to emphasize that this is a beginning, just a beginning. It tells us the message of Jesus coming. It is a beginning. There's more to come. There's more that has to happen. But it's a beginning. And then his life and ministry, and that was a beginning. It pointed forward. It was preparation for something more. And then there was his work on the cross, his death. But that was a beginning. Now, think carefully about this. There are some who seem to treat the cross of Christ as the end of the story. But it isn't. In fact, the gospel makes this clear through the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus required his death on the cross, but couldn't have happened without the death on the cross. But the death on the cross was sterile without the resurrection. The resurrection was in fact the demonstration of the new life that had been gained through the death on the cross. And of course the story goes on, his ascension, the sending of the Spirit, the life of the Spirit in the church, the growth of the church, all of this was the continuation of the gospel that began in the events that Mark recorded. His redemption on the cross led to a new life, new hopes, new tasks. And so the New Testament writers pick this up, not quite knowing where it is going to take them, because the gospel takes us beyond. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And John himself says, "Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known." It's amazing. We sometimes seem to think that it's all tied up, all sorted. We know it all. And yet there is so much more. He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." This is why Jesus tells us that if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And this is why Paul tells us that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. So let's be clear. We are called to live on the far side of the cross, to live a life that takes us beyond the beginning. Every act of ours, every contact, every person in our lives are all touched by the reality of the gospel, which hopefully we began and we are taking further. The life of Jesus, the life of the Spirit working in us and through us. So let's continue on that journey. Even while we're isolated, we can actually spend time with the Lord and grow and be ready for the next step of knowledge and understanding in that gospel that we have barely begun. Let's discover that journey together. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory.